Hi all. So today we're actually going to enter into our final section of the textbook. These last three chapters, chapters 20 through 22, or 20 through 22, ultimately are going to introduce us to how we model economic fluctuations, particularly short-run fluctuations. What you're going to see over the following chapters is you're going to see how everything we've talked about to this point, GDP, open and closed economies, monetary policy, growth, all these come together in one succinct model that allows us to understand and replicate what we expect to happen and occur in the macroeconomy. So let's hop straight to it. Chapter 20 introduces us to the model and the main tool we use to analyze these fluctuations. This is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Now, why do we need a model for macroeconomic activity? Well, the reason why is that economies fluctuate from year to year, typically positive, and meaning that productivity rises. Sometimes, however, these fluctuations can be negative. It seems about once a decade now. And these are recessions. A recession is a period of declining real incomes and rising unemployment. Depression is a severe recession. So when you've had a recession or your economy has posted negative growth for 2 or 3 quarters in a row, we typically then consider economy to be entering a full-on recession. And when the recession reaches high levels of unemployment, at this point, we consider it to be a depression. So how do we understand these fluctuations? Well, typically we use the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, or the EDAS model. But first, 3 key facts. And the fact of business fluctuations, business cycle fluctuations. Fact 1 is that economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Now, some might argue against this and say, well, if they're happening once every 10 years, maybe that means they're not, maybe that means they are predictable. But actually, that mistakes a few things in economic crisis. Right, COVID. How could we predict a virus? We could predict the consequences of a global virus, but we can't necessarily predict when the virus will occur. And the one before that, right, the housing crisis in 2008, the mortgage loan crisis, that was an institutional problem rather than a biological problem. And then the recession before that, the tech bubble boom in 2000. The recession before that, well, there were a few smaller ones, but the biggest crisis we can think of at that point is in the 1970s when Iran and OPEC, OPEC in general, embargoed the United States from oil reserves and oil supplies, which drove up oil prices. So basically, and if we go before that, we'll continue on. That's a political crisis, but if we continue backward further, what we find is that we get the Great Depression. And what was the Great Depression? Well, it was a result of deflation and monetary policy. The point of this is that each one of these causes is distinct and unique and very different than the other causes. Typically, while they share similar themes and characteristics, they are not predictable, so to speak. This leads us to fact 2. Most macroeconomic quantities fluctuate together. So if an economy is growing, we typically expect unemployment will be going down, and we typically expect that inflation will be going up. In this sense, inflation, unemployment, and growth are fluctuating together in relatively consistent ideas and relationships. So if productivity is growing up and unemployment is going down, and we expect then that incomes are also rising. So what this means is that we can actually keep trace of the economy through just a handful of quantities and variables because they tend to track well together. And fact 3 is simply that as output falls, unemployment rises. And this is simple enough to consider, right? That if industry is on a decline, they have to start laying off workers. If they're laying off workers, that means unemployment is rising. This is what we've seen recently with the COVID crisis, is that COVID has forced employers to lay people off, leading to higher unemployment rates. Now, some interesting notes here. Let's look at these short-run economic fluctuations. If you notice here, just proof that the variables fluctuate together. Real GDP has typically fluctuated upwards with minor dips. And if we look over here, we see that investment spending has also tended to fluctuate along with GDP, real GDP. It has gone up as real GDP has gone up, with a significant dip in this period, the 07-08 crisis. Now, you might be wondering, why is investments dip so much more dramatic than real GDP's dips? And there's two reasons. One, GDP is a much larger, is a sum of consumption, investment, government, and net exports, right? So these numbers are dampening the dip caused by investment spending, off investment spending. But there's another thing. What's required to do investment spending? Yeah, you have to take on debt, and that means taking on risk. So why would you take on debt and take on risk if you're in the midst of a recession when things are highly volatile? For that reason, we typically expect that investment will dip down, and it's partly because of people trying to take protective and defensive measures. Finally, just notice that unemployment rate, when we see these dips in the economy, we also typically tend to see spikes in the unemployment rate. So how can we explain these short-run economic fluctuations? Well, we can begin with the assumptions that classical economics made. First off, these assumptions are the classical dichotomy, which is separation of real nominal variables. So when we talked about real GDP, or the actual value of what a nation produces in a year, that is distinct from nominal variables, which were the real output of a country multiplied by the price level. And because of the classical dichotomy, we came to the conclusion that monetary neutrality exists, which was that changes in the money supply only affect nominal variables. So the reality of short-run fluctuations is that, in general, economists believe classical theory reflects the world in the long run, but not the short run. So this idea of monetary neutrality, that changes in the money supply only affect nominal variables, we expect to occur in the long run. That is, there are absolute limits on a country's output, and if there are these absolute limits, then presumably that means that no matter what we do to the monetary supply, we can't ultimately affect these numbers in the long run. But what also allows us to understand this is if we use the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And this is the model used by most economists to explain short-run fluctuations in economic activity around a long-run trend. And it does this is we have an aggregate demand curve, which is a curve that shows the quantity of goods and services that households, firms, the government, and customers abroad want to buy at each price level. If that sounds familiar, that's because, yeah, you got it. The aggregate demand curve is pretty much a reflection of our GDP, gross domestic product. Similarly, the aggregate supply curve, this is a curve that shows the quantity of goods and services that firms choose to produce and sell at each price level. So this is based on how much goods and what's determining them. And ultimately, again, as you can see here, in a lot of ways, this sounds like a typical marketplace. And as you'll see on the next slide, that's kind of because it does resemble a market. So the ADAS model, if we break it down here, what we see is that the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, much as the market supply curve was in chapter 4. And it follows the same rule. As the price level increases, we expect the aggregate supply to increase. However, in contrast, we see the aggregate demand follows a similar law of demand, that as the price level decreases, the aggregate demand quantity increases. Now, where these two intersect, where aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersects, this establishes our equilibrium price level and our equilibrium level output, because this is the point that the aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equivalent to one another and are in balance. Now, again, I mentioned chapter 4 just because I want to highlight something here. Why is it this way? Well, in reality, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply are measurements which we use to kind of capture the fact that, measurements we use to capture the fact that basically we have summed together all the individual markets and all the individual market supplies in a country to generate one general overview and general measurement for the overall economic health of the country. Well, let's break down these curves a little more. That curve slope upward? Well, remember that GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And this is also equivalent to the aggregate spending in a country. And this aggregate spending is influenced by a few things we've mentioned earlier. These things are the price level and consumption, and this was the wealth effect. And this was the idea that there's a relationship between decreased price level and increased spending, or that a decreased price level, in fact, ensures that individuals are quote unquote wealthier. Also, we have the price level investment, i.e. the interest rate effect. And this referred to the fact that the relationship between lower price levels leads to a lower savings rate and more investment spending. So why would this be the case? Well, if you have a lower price level, that means that there's a lower demand for monetary holdings, as we've mentioned in chapter 16 and 17. And with this lower demand for monetary holdings, we also see that we don't necessarily need as much, cash on hand. Also, we have the price level net export, or the exchange rate effect. And this is that a fall in the price level causes a fall in interest rates, which makes the real value of a currency decline in FX markets, ultimately increasing exports and demand for domestic goods and services. Now, summarized, what we see here is that three distinct but related reasons a fall in the price level increases the quantity of goods and services demanded. In the first case, consumers are wealthier, which stimulates demand. In second, interest rates fall, which stimulates investment. And in the third, currency depreciates, which stimulates net exports. So why might the aggregate demand curve shift? Well, there's a few reasons. One, if consumption changes. So for example, let's say that people are feeling confident about the economy and decide to spend more. That ultimately would lead to an increase in our demand. Similarly, if we had changes in investment, let's say that we'll feel confident in that, or to give an even simpler example, let's say the government regulations which allow more firms to borrow. If more firms are able to borrow and have less costs and risk, then presumably this would stir investment and shift toward increasing our demand. Similarly, changes in government purchases. If the government decides to invest more and spend more, then ultimately this also leads to an increase in the demand curve, in the aggregate demand curve. And finally, changes in net exports. If foreign consumers want more and more of our domestic goods, then presumably we find that ultimately this also contributes to our aggregate demand. Note, these shifts are occurring due to changes in the variables that sum up to GDP, right? So consumption, investment, government purchase, and net exports. If you have something which seems like it would shift any of these four variables, whether as increasing or decreasing, well, that means the aggregate demand curve is also shifting. Now, I want to point this table out. We're not going to go over it because we've already talked through all this information. But I want to point out to you that Table 1 in your textbook, the aggregate demand curve, this is a great summary explaining all you need to know about the aggregate demand curve. It mentions the three effects which make it downward sloping. And then it also mentions 4 examples upon which the aggregate demand curve might shift. So just want to highlight, be sure to check out Table 1. It's a fantastic little resource. Now, this means, though, that we should get to the aggregate supply curve. Where we're going to start off, though, is just note that in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical. And while it slopes upward in the short run, this long-run vertical shape is due to the fact that GDP depends upon its supplies of labor, capital, natural resources, and energy. Or, you might remember, these are our factors of production. So let's think about this in an example to explain why the aggregate supply curve is vertical. A country, if land is one of the factors in a country's ability to produce, right? Land is capped, right? The United States has not grown as a land mass in the past 50 years. So this means that we can maximize and tap out all the land we have available for production. Because of that, and because the other factors of production can similarly be capped, we ultimately have to realize that the long-run supply curve is fixed. That means it cannot increase further because we've exhausted all the factors of production we have available to us. This vertical shape is also a reflection of the classical dichotomy, i.e., the idea that real variables do not change despite numerical shifts. In this case, the real variable is our output. And if you check here, what you'll see is in the long-run aggregate supply curve, by it being a vertical curve, we see that changes in the price level ultimately are not leading to any changes in output. Output is fixed. Now, I want to summarize the long-run aggregate supply curve, and we'll get into this a little bit more in a second. But the key thing here is, why does the short-run aggregate supply curve slope upward? Well, ultimately, this reason why is a few things. We have the sticky wage theory, and this is an unexpectedly low price level raises the real wage, which causes firms to hire fewer workers and produce a smaller quantity of goods and services. We also have the sticky price theory, which is an unexpectedly low price level leaves some firms with higher than desired prices, which depresses their sales and leads them to cut their production. This is basically the idea that if price levels are a bit lower than we expected and inflation was lower than expected, firms have overpriced themselves in expectation of inflation, and ultimately this means that their goods are less attractive and less desirable than they otherwise would be. And the final thing is the misperception theory, and this is that unexpectedly low price levels lead some suppliers to think their prices have fallen, which induces a fall in production. So basically, if producers think that no one's buying their goods or that their prices are dropping because people aren't buying their goods, ultimately we can kind of consider this as symbolic of an idea that they're scared that ultimately maybe their supply is about to go downhill, and maybe they're not going to make revenues necessary. So that's what the idea behind the perception theory is. Now, what we're going to find, though, is that the aggregate supply curve can also shift. It might shift from changes in labor or changes in capital, natural resources, technology, or in the expected price level. Now, if you notice, the aggregate demand curve shifted because it was composed of the GDP, and those variables of GDP might shift. Well, similarly, the aggregate supply curve is shifted by what we have of the factors of production. So if anything occurs which would change significantly the factors of production, you would also expect then our aggregate supply curve to also shift. Now, we can use the ADAS model to depict long-run growth and inflation then. And basically, if you look over here at the graph, what you'll see is the short-run fluctuations in output and the price level should be viewed as deviations from the long-run trends of output growth and inflation. So what we mean by that is it's nice and easy to see here a long-run trend by which the aggregate demand intersects the long-run aggregate supply, that the aggregate demand then increases over time, and leading to the aggregate supply also long-run aggregate supply shifting upward. And we can see that at each one of these new intersections, right, we have had an increase in the price level and an increase in the long-run aggregate supply and output. So to break this down, in the long run, technological progress shifts long-run aggregate supply, which with the growth of the money supply shifts aggregate demand, which leads to growth in output, as we can see here. So the rightward shift from technology corresponds to a rightward shift in aggregate demand, and the two of them result in a higher output and ultimately ongoing inflation. So why does the aggregate supply curve upward in the short run? Oh goodness, excuse me. Why does the AS curve slope upward in the run? Well, the quantity of output supplied deviates from its long-run or natural level when the actual price level in the economy deviates from the price level that expected to prevail. We mentioned these theories, the sticky wage theory, the sticky price theory, and the misperceptions theory. But we can sum this up as simply saying the quantity of output supplied equals the natural level of output plus A, the actual price level, minus the expected price level. Now, you might be wondering, why does the expected price level have such a significant role in understanding why do these expectations have such a significant role? Well, the answer is we make our decisions, and economically, the rational actor tries to maximize based upon what they expect will happen in the future, right? So when you play a game with someone, you try to make your decision based upon what you think they're going to do. And basically, we consider that at the aggregate level, individuals do this for their economic outcomes. So we can look at the short-run aggregate supply curve as follows. Notice that if we zoom in here, we simply find that a decrease in the price level, in this case from P1 to P2, corresponds to a reduction in the quantity of goods and services supplied in the short run. So this is a nice little succinct relationship. And again, we explained that this downward slope could be due to things like sticky wages, sticky prices, or misperceptions. However, over time, wages, prices, and perceptions adjust, so the relationship is only temporary. Now, with that, let's get into a couple of examples of economic fluctuations. But before we get to those economic fluctuations, let's just combine everything we have now. So we have the short-run aggregate supply curve is this upward sloping curve due to the three theories we talked about: sticky prices, misperceptions, sticky wages. And similarly, we had aggregate demand, which shows us that it's downward sloping, again due to similar things. Now, The long-run aggregate supply curve sounds vertical, and where they all intersect shows us the equilibrium price at the natural level of output. And just a reminder, the natural level of output is ultimately the level of output where the economy is fully using its factors of production, and it's where the natural level of unemployment hovers, which, if you don't remember how we measure natural level of unemployment, that's the point where all unemployment in the economy is either structural or structural or frictional. So what can cause economic fluctuations? Simply put, just two things: a shift in the aggregate demand and a shift in the aggregate supply. So we have 4 steps for analyzing these macroeconomic fluctuations. The first is decide whether the event shifts the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate supply curve, or both. So if the population grew, that's an example of something that would shift both the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply curve. If the population grew, that means we're going to have higher consumption, but it also means we're going to have a higher labor supply. Now, once you know this, you need to decide which direction the curve shifts. Is it going to shift aggregate demand or aggregate supply, or both upward, downward, or in opposite directions? Now, you can use the diagram of aggregate demand and aggregate supply then to determine the impact on output and the price level in the short run. So draw these shifts on your graph, and where the new equilibrium is established, that tells you ultimately what has occurred due to these shifts. And you can use the diagram of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to analyze how the economy moves from its new short-run equilibrium to its long-run equilibrium. So if it's a temporary shift, what happens to the economy? What drives down? So for example, as we'll see in the next slide, what happens if aggregate demand shifts? Well, note that point A is our starting point. This is where we have a natural level of output, and there are price levels at P1. So if we have a decrease in the aggregate demand in this model, we have a shift leftward in the aggregate demand curve. And it now intersects the aggregate supply curve at point B, which is a lower price level and a lower output level. However, this is at the end, because the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift due to this lower price level, and technology will advance, etc. And ultimately, this will lead us to restoring at point C, and that is where our output returns to its natural level. Now, you might say, well, wait, why would a decrease in aggregate demand lead to a reduced price level and then eventually return to the same level of output? Well, to give you an example, just look at Walmart and Amazon over the Great Recession. Companies that do well during recessions are companies that typically figure out ways to cut cost. And so Walmart particularly invested heavily in research and technology to develop its supply chain, create better cost, and reduce the price level further. So we can see kind of this relationship effect in other firms and industries as well. But these aren't our only shifters. We also have to consider the effects of a shift in aggregate supply. In the worst case scenario, a shift in aggregate supply can lead to what we call stagflation, and that's a period of falling output and rising prices. Now, 2 key points to keep in mind: shifts in aggregate supply can cause stagflation, and policymakers who can influence aggregate demand can potentially mitigate the adverse impact on output, but only at the cost of exacerbating the problem of inflation. So let's look at what we mean by this. If we look at the aggregate supply curve, we can see how a decline in supply leads to us arriving at point B, a higher price level and a lower output. So this is what we mean by stagflation. The economy is stagnant in the sense that it is not growing, or in this case, it is decreasing. However, there's also inflation. So because we've increased our price level from price 1 to price 2. So when we take all this into account, again, we come to the idea that there is such a thing as stagflation. This actually is a serious problem that has occurred in multiple countries. For example, Japan over the 2000s into the 2010s has struggled with stagflation for a while now. However, what we find is that you can recover from an adverse aggregate supply curve shift. So due to the classical dichotomy of monetary neutrality, one of the things we know is that we expect that we should return to the long-run aggregate supply. So while we shift from point A to point B, and we're at a price level of P2 and a decreased natural level of output, what we expect is that with this short-run aggregate supply falling, following, policymakers can accommodate the shift by expanding. So let me zoom in here. They can accommodate the shift by expanding aggregate demand. So by using policy to shift aggregate demand rightward, we reestablish a new equilibrium at point C, which means that we had a higher price level and forced it up further than where it was at just accepting the aggregate supply shift leftward. However, this does allow us to restore the economy back to its natural level of output. At the heart of this is basically a simple realization that the government has policies at its disposal to reduce unemployment, but this can and possibly will and very likely could come at the cost of ultimately higher inflation, which can create problems in and of itself. So, for conclusion, I want you to consider both these models. Now, there are two videos attached here. Of course, the links won't work for you in a video, but I want to suggest you go to marginalrevolutionuniversity.org and you check out their videos on the business cycle, and particularly their videos on analyzing business cycles in this section called Office. It's a great little work. I want you to note one or two things about this video, though. The first thing is that, sorry, excuse me, man, catching my throat. The first thing is that they will use something else to stimulate aggregate demand. They'll use the quantity equation for money. Why? Well, if you remember, we said that the quantity equation for money is basically captures the aggregate demand because it relates the nominal GDP to the quantity of money. But there's another reason why, because there's multiple schools of thought in economics. One of the schools of thought is monetarist, and MRU.org is a monetarist group largely. So I recommend checking videos out. They'll give you great practice and another way to think your way through these aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves. One more thing to keep in mind, while we've considered two versions of just a simple aggregate supply shift and a simple aggregate shift, there's no reason why there can't be multiple shifts. I mentioned a case, for example, where the population grows and you have a double shift. But this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So do keep in mind what happens when you have a double shift. And the answer is simply draw the shifts out on your curve and pay attention to where the new equilibriums are established along the way. All right, that's all I have for y'all today. Thanks so much. Hope y'all enjoyed it. And we're down to the final two chapters. And in the next chapter, we get to one of the more exciting topics in econ, finally looking at how policy affects our ability to fight recessions. All right, till